Therapy with Survivors of Narcissistic Abuse. Part 4, the client's key traumas. Well, in order to understand how a client may use therapy to achieve their goals, it's important to understand the specific adversities they've had to cope with that have led to them feeling like their goals have been out of reach to date. In this video, I'm going to discuss the definition of trauma, or a form of adversity, from control mastery theory. Next, I'll discuss the kinds of traumas that clients may have suffered and how understanding a client's key traumas helps you infer the client's goals and interfering pathogenic beliefs. Well, this video is the fourth in a 6-part series on control mastery theory and how you can learn to apply this approach in your own clinical work. It's, as I said, a 6-part series and covers these topics. Part 1 was an overview of control mastery theory. Part 2 was about the client's goals. Part 3, we covered the client's pathogenic beliefs. Today I'm going to discuss the client's key traumas. Next, we'll talk about how clients may test pathogenic beliefs. And 6 will be 5 steps towards case formulation. Well, my name is Jay Reed, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in California, and I specialize in the treatment of survivors of narcissistic abuse. I work from a form of therapy called control mastery theory, which prizes the client's efforts to overcome the trauma of narcissistic abuse and realize a fuller and richer quality of life for themselves. If this topic interests you, then I encourage you to learn more by getting my free ebook on the topic. It's titled Effective Therapy with Survivors of Narcissistic Abuse, The Basics of Control Mastery Theory. And you can find the link to the free ebook in the description box below or by clicking here. Well, what is a key trauma? Control mastery theory defines trauma as any event or context that exceeds an individual's coping resources at that particular moment. Another prominent theorist and researcher in control mastery theory named George Silberschatz splits traumas into 2 types, or 2 categories. The first is shock traumas, and these are singular events that are catastrophic in nature. So examples include car accidents, war, terrorism, and or the sudden loss of a loved one. The other form of key traumas are called stress traumas, and these are contexts that exert significant strain and stress on an individual over long periods of time. And examples of stress traumas include a child in an abusive or neglectful relationship with a parent, getting bullied at school, and included are being the scapegoat child to a narcissistic parent. Of course, someone may suffer different types of traumas, but the ones that are labeled key traumas by control mastery theory are those that lead to the client adopting a pathogenic belief in order to cope with the trauma. In fact, recent research on pathogenic beliefs and traumas have shown that it's not the extent of traumas suffered that predicts post-traumatic suffering, but rather whether the client adopts a pathogenic belief in order to cope with the trauma. Well, another prominent theorist and researcher in the control mastery theory field named Francesco Gazzillo has emphasized that traumas typically only lead to pathogenic beliefs when the sufferer of the trauma determines that it's the pursuit of a healthy developmental goal which led to the trauma. And this understanding, I think, is important because it speaks to the child experiencing the stress trauma of having a psychologically compromised parent and reasoning in their sort of child way, which tends to be more egocentric and sort of locating the cause of events as to lay within themselves, that child reasoning that it was their pursuit of something that they actually should be pursuing, like feeling good about themselves or having a sense of independence or empowerment, that led to the stress trauma of, say, a parent being unavailable to them, prone to depression, or what have you. Well, let's illustrate some of these points, again, with the case of Sarah, who I introduced in part 1 of this series. And we'll see how her father's depressiveness became a key trauma for her. We might assume that Sarah, as a young child, would have looked to her father to show life, energy, and happiness, particularly in relation to her. But then as he appeared listless in front of the TV and uninterested in her, she could have been gravely disappointed and scared that he seemed so unreachable to her and, again, uninterested. This would constitute a stress trauma of her father being emotionally unavailable to her due to his depression. Let's also assume that Sarah did not have an adult or older sibling to kind of talk to and make sense out of her father's behavior for her to get to know it wasn't her fault or a result of something she had done or not done. That she was essentially on her own to figure out her feelings and try to avoid the trauma of her father feeling unreachable to her. As she learned that her father would respond to her efforts to cheer him up, she reasoned that it was her interests and goals that took her away from cheering him up that was the problem. And this is where her father's depressiveness became a key trauma for Sarah, because she identified the root cause of this trauma to be her own healthy developmental goal of putting her happiness first. That is, putting her happiness first interfered with the constant task of being at home and cheering him up. So she had to develop a pathogenic belief that got her to stop pursuing her own developmental needs in this regard and prioritize the task of cheering her father up virtually all the time. Well, one way of learning what a client's key traumas were in their lives at the start of treatment is to ask them to name 3 of their favorite and least favorite memories from their childhood. This kind of question is usually experienced as curious and not too threatening. And sometimes a client's key traumas may even be unknown to them, particularly when they face psychological and or emotional neglect or abuse from a parent. In these instances, the client may not have had a different frame of reference to know that their parent's treatment was traumatic to them and abnormal. And so I work with such clients by listening closely to how they describe typical interactions with a parent who I suspect may have been psychologically or emotionally compromised. And if the client reports, often in a kind of offhanded way, a pattern of going unresponded to, punished regularly or harshly for kind of benign actions on their part, and or being treated as though their needs were less important than the parent's needs, then I might begin to follow up with more questions about such instances. And if the client reports patterns that were typical but seem to be neglectful and or abusive towards them, then I'll often freely share my reaction as like, wow, that sounds like you really weren't, offered much in this relationship in the case of, say, neglect, or that there weren't too many people curious about what you were feeling and where your inner experience seemed to matter to them, or in the case of if the client seems to have experienced outright abuse, emotional or physical, sort of freely expressing my reactions like that sounds like something a child should not be exposed to and seems wholly undeserved that you were treated in this manner. And often these sorts of reactions on the part of the therapist can be extremely useful to such clients because it, I think, affords them a needed frame of reference to know that the way they were habitually treated by a parent was damaging and undeserved. Well, this video was about the key traumas that clients can experience generally, but there are more specific forms of key traumas that can occur for survivors of narcissistic abuse. And I discussed these types of traumas in great depth in my 3-hour online course on effective therapy for survivors of narcissistic abuse. And it's a very reasonably priced course, in my opinion, because I really want to make the barriers to entry accessible enough to generate a thriving community of helping professionals who are committed to developing tools with one another to best help survivors of narcissistic abuse. As such, I have an accompanying private Facebook group to come together with other helping professionals and discuss clinical challenges, successes, and ideas related to this topic. You can find the link to the course in the description box below or by clicking here. Well, I hope you found today's video helpful in understanding that a trauma becomes a key trauma from the lens of control mastery theory when the client has understood that it's their pursuit of a developmental goal which led to the trauma, and therefore develops a pathogenic belief that if they abandon that developmental goal, they will protect themselves from that trauma happening again. Well, in the next video, I'm going to talk about how clients can test pathogenic beliefs in therapy in the hopes that those pathogenic beliefs will be disconfirmed so they feel freer and safer to reach their goals.